I take it that everyone can hear me clearly. I must begin by asking.
Yes, you are. We are.
Yes? Good. Thank you very much. And my greetings to everyone. Very sorry not to be with you, except in this kind of spiritual form. But am I still audible? Yes? I no longer hear the room. Okay. I'd really hoped, since we've just had Storm Dara in town here in the south of England, I'd hoped to be able really today to start by saying once more the storm is howling, so that everyone there could feel even happier about their balmy temperatures. But the storm has stopped howling just for a bit. So I'd like to contribute my pennyworth to the panel discussion today, really by asking a question that I think impinges in some ways on Eliot and Yeats, but more broadly on how we value Yeats's work or art. I've called the paper Saying a Thing for reasons that I hope will become obvious. And I'll be making constant reference, or frequent reference, to the third section of Yeats's sequence, The Tower, a section written, I think, in late-ish 1925. And I'm sure that you all have that in your engraved safely in your memories. Okay, so I shall begin by quoting Yeats. And I declare my faith. I mock Plotinus' thought and cry in Plato's teeth. W.B. Yeats's diction in these 3 lines is not exactly polite, or rather it swerves sharply from the quasi-legal formality of I declare, which had been deployed 19 lines earlier in the poem, when I declare they shall inherit my pride, to the raucous I mock. You can declare something with legally binding effect, but mockery carries no such performative force. Mockery, though, can be known by its physicality of expression. So Plotinus' master comes into range, up close and personal, with and cry in Plato's teeth. If we call this a rhetorical gesture, or the gesturing of rhetoric, we should also acknowledge that it carries a certain literary freight or abusive literary precedent. In Act 4, Scene 7 of Hamlet, Claudius tells Laertes of the prince's return to Denmark by reading aloud the note he's just received. High and mighty, you shall know I am set naked on your kingdom. And in his exasperation asks, what should this mean? Or is it some abuse and no such thing? Laertes can't be of much help. I'm lost in it, my lord, but let him come. It warms the very sickness in my heart that I shall live and tell him to his teeth, thus didst thou. In Julius Caesar, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Brutus imagines all his faults observed, set in a notebook, learned and conned by rote to cast into my teeth. And a furious Octavius declares, defiance, traitors, hurl we in your teeth. It's not that Yeats is necessarily alluding to Shakespeare when he cries in Plato's teeth. Instead, his diction hears and responds to the rhetorical promptings that make angry assertion sound properly angry and assertive. And whether or not Yeats had Shakespeare in mind or had him in his ear, he certainly knew that this line of the poem would find an echo in another of his own poems, eventually to be included 30 odd pages on in the Tower, having languished from 1912 until 1922 in a Lady Gregory enforced quarantine. That is a poem called The New Faces, with its jaw-breaking line that is a mouthful of monosyllables. Where we wrought, that shall break the teeth of time. From declare to crying in someone's teeth is a quick escalation here. The precipitousness of this is present in the earliest drafts, though Yeats had initially and briefly thought he might declare in Plato's teeth, but that was evidently too much of a stretch and was quickly deleted. The third section of the Tower is shaped as a testament. Parts of it do indeed carry testamentary force, and in this respect it bears comparison with the later and more knockabout under Ben Bulben. As Yeats knew, the poem as testament has medieval roots in François Villon, but he also knew, Villon's testaments are not primarily literal ones. This is not to say they're not serious, any more than the Tower 3 is not serious. And Yeats's poem carries some marks of the business-like. Its first line declares, "It is time that I wrote my will," and what follows is understood by nearly all readers as an articulation of that will. The second line tells us that I choose upstanding men. And after 5 more lines, it's clear these men are chosen heirs. They shall inherit my... A lawyer, though, might point out that it is time that I wrote my will is not the same thing as saying the following is my will, so that the upstanding men may not have so secure a legal claim as they seem to at first sight. But here we're in a special area of what is and is not serious. And for this, the well-known sentences of J.L. Austen are important. I quote these sentences of Austen, which are well known partly because they're quoted by Geoffrey Hill. And I might mention that quite differently again. We could be issuing any of these utterances as we can issue an utterance of any kind whatsoever, in the course, for example, of acting a play, or making a joke, or writing a poem. In which case, of course, it would not be seriously meant, and we shall not be able to say that we seriously performed the act concerned. That's Austen. How serious, then, for example, is the word upstanding? At first glance, it might appear fatally relative, for in the usual sense of the word, some people are held to be upstanding where others are not. For multitudinous reasons, all of these ultimately subjective. Is the legacy of Yeats's pride to be claimed by simply being, or rather being found, more upstanding than the next man? But again, this is a lawyer's quibble, and one which the poetry is able to dismiss, though not, in an unpoetic sense, to annul. The upstanding men of Yeats's poem are not metaphorically, but literally upstanding, for they're standing up in order to climb the streams until the fountain leap, and at dawn drop their cast at the side of dripping stone. It would seem then that upstanding is a perfectly serious word, describing an act that could be seriously performed. It means what it says. On the other hand, the legacy itself is not serious in Austen's or any legal sense, for it is intangible. My pride With this, we discover that this pride is itself originally a matter of inheritance, with its historical and cultural provenance made explicit. They shall inherit my pride, the pride of people that were bound neither to cause nor to state, neither to slaves that were spat on, nor to the tyrants that spat, the people of Burke and of Grattan that gave, though free to refuse. That proper name, the name of Henry Grattan, provokes Yeats's verse into a splatter of rhymes that anticipates the physicality of cry in Plato's teeth. State, spat on, spat, Grattan. These are not rhymes to be taken quietly, or lines that can ever be delivered sotto voce. And what kind of serious meaning might they be said to have? The attempt at a testament, one might say, is here abandoned in favour of the making of a speech. And the lines are certainly what we usually mean when we use the term rhetorical. This might feel appropriate in some way, since both Burke and Grattan were famously eloquent speakers, with Burke at least famous for his eloquence on the page also. Though in fact, Yeats's first choice here was not Burke at all, but the dramatic maker of imagined eloquence, John Synge. Spitting, however, is eloquence of a wholly different kind, if it can count as eloquence at all. It may indeed be the opposite of spoken eloquence, but the mouth that can spit is the same mouth that can speechify. And Yeats's poem does move almost immediately to another way of imagining pride, one that is much closer to the kind of imagery that might figure in an eloquent speech. Pride, like that of the morn when the headlong light is loose. As a piece of diction, the morn is as high as the fabulous horn with which it will soon rhyme. A morn that is promised is liable to be tinged with some kind of political hope, and here in Yeats's poem it arrives as the simile for a bequeathed pride. In fact, Grattan might not be quite off the scene there. In Aubrey de Vere's Inishoil, the poem called Grattan covers just such hopeful figurative ground. Grattan spake, the great and proud gave way, and the dawn began which shall end in day. The verse there is something a bit less than poetry, perhaps, but it is fully up to the mark for oratory. For Yeats, Grattan's legacy, like his own, will consist in pride rather than making the proud give way. Already, this is at an angle to the merely rhetorical. At the level of sense, it demands a certain concentration. How might the morn be proud, for example? And remarkably here, the dawn does not break, but it breaks loose. And it does so headlong, as though with some reckless, unpremeditated energy. The effect is not pictorial, but hortatory. It is as though pride obliges the upstanding men to unconstrained action, making that morn heedless as well as headlong. The promised Irish dawn waits somewhere too in Lionel Johnson's poem, Ireland, where Grattan is made to keep poetic company. There the white soul of Davis, there the worn waste soul of Mangan, there the surging soul of Grattan, hunger for thy promised morn. In such performances, as poetical as they are rhetorical, actual mornings are neither involved nor to the point. Yeats's poem knows all about prophetic dawns, and the diction shows as much. But the upstanding men, nevertheless, go into a morning that is a real one, and engage in the real, if still, for the author of The Fisherman, metaphorically charged, sport of fly fishing. How might all this impinge on any decisions about what is and what is not seriously meant in Yeats? The poet was not, after all, only a poet. He was a playwright, a journalist, a critic, a writer of fiction, a theatrical manager, a politician, and other things besides, not the least of these a public speaker. None of these functions was easily learned. None came naturally. One section of Reveries over Childhood and Youth, published in 1916, recalls Yeats's times at Charles Oldham's Contemporary Club and other places on the Dublin talking circuit in the 1880s. I'll just quote to you from Yeats's account of this, written, of course, many years after the event. I had begun to frequent a club founded by Mr. Oldham, not from natural liking, but from a secret ambition. I wished to become self-possessed, to be able to play with hostile minds, as Hamlet played, to look in the lion's face, as it were, with unquivering eyelash. In Ireland, harsh argument, which had gone out of fashion in England, was still the manner of our conversation, and at this club unionist and nationalist could interrupt one another and insult one another without the formal and traditional restraint of public speech. Sometimes they would change the subject and discuss socialism or a philosophical question, merely to discover their old passions under a new shape. I spoke easily, and I thought well, till someone was rude, and then I would become silent, or exaggerate my opinion to absurdity, or hesitate and grow confused, or be carried away myself by some party passion. I would spend hours afterwards going over my words and putting the wrong ones right, discovering that I was only self-possessed with people I knew intimately. I would often go to a strange house where I knew I would spend a wretched hour for schooling's sake. I did not discover that Hamlet had his self-possession from no schooling, but from indifference and passion-conquering sweetness, and that less heroic minds can but hope it from old age. Yeats's remembered efforts, going over my words and putting the wrong ones right, are memories of acts that were being made against the grain. There is an interesting uncertainty here about whether self-possession is a form of self-defeat. As often, Hamlet is the presiding dramatic figure. Even earlier, as Yeats recalled, Hamlet was an image of heroic self-possession for the poses of youth and childhood to copy, a combatant of the battle within myself. But it's clear that from the perspective of just after 1914, at least, Yeats understood public speech as both an engagement with the harsh argument of social antagonism of many kinds, and a place of meeting between himself and the literary powers that in possessing the self might offer it self-possession. Hamlet here teaching the young man to play with hostile minds. It's an important phrase. We can be specific about some of those minds and whose they were, even though the question itself goes beyond specifics and affects the entire matter of Yeats's poetry and how it's a vehicle for the seriously meant. Undoubtedly, this goes beyond Yeats and is inherent in the whole success and difficulty of poetry's language before and after his time. However, one hostile mind that haunted Yeats, I think, all the way through, was that of the Dublin barrister, John F. Taylor. 12 years Yeats's senior, he died in 1902 on the same day, oddly enough, as the poet's friend, Lionel Johnson. The two of them were commemorated instantly together at a Dublin meeting by Charles Gavan Duffy. A renowned public speaker, Taylor had been associated with Duffy closely, and he had got the better of Yeats in more than one controversy over nationalism and national literature in Ireland. He was a Roman Catholic. He had managed to take Yeats's place in John O'Leary's affections. And even worse than that, he was thought also to have been paying court to Maud Gonne. As minds go, the hostility here was certainly mutual. He evidently loathed Yeats, and Yeats felt much the same about him. More than a decade after Taylor's death, Yeats was still playing with his hostile mind. In his draft autobiography of around 1916, Yeats portrayed Taylor as a gaunt, ungainly man whose mind was perpetually occupied with an impassioned argument, to which he brought vast historical erudition upon the justice of the national cause. Evidently, though, no mistake in debate ever went unnoticed or unpunished. This is Yeats again. He had a mystical faith derived from Catholic orthodoxy in logic to its last extreme. He was enraged, and he seemed at times to live in rage. At my quotation from Blake, "It is ordained that those who cannot defend the truths shall defend an error, that enthusiasm in life may not cease." Error could have no justification. Yeats was probably right in believing Taylor to have been the author of a swinging attack on his first collection in the Freeman's Journal, 1st of February 1889, where the young poet, quote, "has yet to rid his mind of the delusion that obscurity is an acceptable substitute for strenuous thought and sound judgment, and does justice neither to himself nor to his readers when he hides a jumble of confused ideas in a maze of verbiage and calls it all the wanderings of a sheen." Reveries recalls how, quote, "I braved Taylor again and again as one might a savage animal, as a test of courage, but always found him worse than my expectation. I would say, quoting Mill, oratory is heard, poetry is overheard." And he would answer, his voice full of contempt, that there was always an audience. Yet, as a speaker, Taylor could obviously thrill an audience. The young Yeats might have been jealous of him for just this. Yeats gives an account of one speech, quoting it extensively, along with comments on Taylor's dramatic delivery. In the first published version of Reveries, Yeats's implicitly admiring quotation is quickly undercut by what more he has to say about Taylor. He had been in a linen draper's shop for a while and had educated himself and put himself to college, and was now, as a lawyer, famous for hopeless cases where unsure judgment could not make things worse, and eloquence, power of cross-examination and learning might amend all. Conversation with him was always argument, and for an obstinate opponent, he had such phrases as, "Have you your head in a bag, sir?" And I seemed his particular aversion. Now, it was a very long time to hold a grudge, but Yeats does not work in reminiscences like those simply to express a grudge. Rather, he's making clear the reality of the forces which for a long time held him at bay and which his writing had to learn first to understand and then to resist. In this learning process, it was important for Yeats to comprehend the shared ground, the similarities that were also the differences between public expression and poetic creation. But he was obliged to find his voice, as our cliche has it, in a cacophony, where misconstruction was inherent in both public and apparently private areas of literary expression. There was always a John F. Taylor waiting around the corner, wielding superior intelligence, or what passed for it, like a cudgel. There always is. In 1897, Yeats found himself reviewing Duffy's book, Young Ireland, and took a swipe at Taylor as one of those who published in the Library of Ireland hastily written books, among all those for whom literature was a mere medium and not a master. For literature meant to them an exposition of certain opinions about which they were agreed, and of certain types of character which all men might be expected to admire, and not a capricious imagination coming with an unforeseen message out of the dim places of the mind. One can imagine the kind of fun Taylor, for whom some minds were more full of dim places than others, might have had with Yeats's final phrase there. Doubtless, Yeats was learning to imagine just that. He was also learning how to force his way through such things. It is only a minority of Irishmen who understand that nearly all of it, that is, writing inspired by a didactic purpose, that is not politics, is now in one of those infirmaries of the human mind, where Maeterlinck says all truths which are not mystic truths, which are not truths come out of a solitary and mysterious ideal, go at last and to die. Truths is a hard word. Taylor presumably knew what it meant and believed that Yeats's grasp of its meaning was not so secure as his own. Yet the truths of poetry, as Yeats understood, were a different order from the truths enshrined in the poems of Thomas Davis. What is more, these truths are seriously meant. Now, the Tower 3 is full of what Yeats believes can be taken seriously, things that can be referred to seriously and, as it were, can be fully declared. Learned Italian things and the proud stones of Greece. Taylor and his many successors might ask, what, please, is a learned thing? And how can a stone be proud? Yeats's poem has the strength to bat these semantic turns of hostile minds away like midges, and that strength is exercised in the verse's sheer persistence. It's driving ahead into further declaration now of poets' imaginings and memories of love, memories of the words of women, all those things whereof man makes a superhuman, mirror resembling dream. Are imaginings and memories really things? Here, in this utterance, that is, in the continuing context of this particular poem, in these rhymed 3-beat lines, and in this sentence that pushes on so smoothly to its point of rest, they are. And yet, they're not entirely, or perhaps at all, things of this world. If they are items that feature in a will, as Yeats seems to intend, then that will is not one suited for any kind of legal probate. Here, the distinction between the human and the superhuman is one that is, however, rhetorically denied. And this is, of course, a brilliant piece of rhetoric, brilliant in various ways, not least in that it's ready to conduct and to win a quarrel. As a reader, one doesn't especially want to take it on. And more is to come. The beautiful lines on the doors making their nest, the seemingly final naming of heirs with those same upstanding men climbing the mountainside, to whom Yeats explicitly now says, I leave both faith and pride. And again, this is seriously meant, but one might object that its serious meaning is hampered by the intangibility of the very things it bequeaths. However, the genius of the poetry is to expose such objections as themselves poor things, the evidence of a radically impoverished or self-impoverishing kind of understanding. For such minds, poetic truths are not truths and are merely poetic. But to accept this, you must be radically unreceptive to the poetry. Your objections become cries made in its teeth, or the spitting that is used up oratory's last resort. The poem's last movement, the 15 lines that begin with the Hiberno English of "Now shall I make my soul," are lines that face death magnificently and movingly. What they are not is a contribution to the poem's overall testamentary business, which has in fact just concluded at the point when they begin. That's not to say that they are at all an afterthought, but they do constitute a kind of occupation of the poetic ground for which so much has been claimed earlier in the poem. They are poets' imaginings, and not in the stricter sense truth claims. For all this, the lines are essential to the entire poem's rhetorical movement, providing the transcendence of argument and testament that guarantees in its way the strength of those very, very poetic truths that have been put to work and declared. The ground that has indeed been held is poetic ground. And poetic ground is this: now shall I make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school, till the wreck of body, slow decay of blood, testy delirium, or dull decrepitude, or what worse evil come, the death of friends, or death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath, seem but the clouds in the sky when the horizon fades, or a bird's sleepy cry among the deepening shades. An impertinence, surely, to claim that this is anything other than seriously meant. As conclusion to a testamentary act, yes, it is legally irrelevant and meaningless in terms of effect, but this means only that a legal reading is the irrelevant and the meaningless thing. Poetic truth, that is, vanquishes the truth of language that must be and must remain narrow if it is to be seriously meant. One doesn't doubt that the whole subversive testament of the Tower 3 has behind it a testamentary act. In 1926, as in 1915, that might be the last will and testament of Sir Hugh Lane, where an unwitnessed codicil giving the Lane collection of French paintings to Dublin after they'd previously been given to London was not legally binding. Like the entire cool circle, Yeats was deeply involved in the ensuing row, a row that's never probably to be completely concluded. And the defiant tone of Yeats's line 33, and further add to that, knows a thing or two about codicils. Yeats leaves his faith just as he declares it. And the Lane bequest controversy was, of course, all about what faith might be kept, in keeping to either the letter of the law or the spirit of equable acceptance of a dead man's expressed wishes. But the difference at stake was in fact one between faithfulness to these wishes and the fiduciary duty of those who were trustees of the National Gallery in London. As trustees, it was strongly argued, they had no right to hand over the paintings, since to do so would be to accept the sufficiency of a codicil which the law could not recognise as legitimate. In that sense, it was not a question of sympathy, greed, or anything in between, but of having to accept what the law could and could not mean by the serious meaning of some words. Here, serious required the signature of a witness, and a trustee has no choice but to put fiduciary duty over the undefined notions of good faith. In any case, a trustee who knowingly acts against his fiduciary duty is then not able to act as a trustee. So the paintings are not to be handed back even if he decides to do just that. In this debate and in these terms, Yeats's poem speaks with some eloquence. But it speaks even so in the context of hostile minds, and it feels their listening presence. All its constructions know how they can be misconstrued. We might want to call this a public speech aspect of the poem, though as a matter of fact, there is no private obverse here that the poet is trying to suppress or to conceal. Yeats had learned his lessons about this long ago, dealing with the likes of Taylor. Without it, he would not have become the poet he did become. To speak in public is to be aware, in that very speaking, of oneself being ill at ease in speech. Language, even or especially eloquent language, is a hiding away, or more melodramatically perhaps a betrayal, of what in the thinking self comes before and after the business of communication. A poet will have to learn to get over that. For if I say a true thing and say a thing truly, what good is that to the I that speaks? In this respect, literary writing covers its own embarrassments more efficiently, or at least more convincingly, than the awkward performances of having to say a few words in public. In this way, or at this cost, real poetry can say things. There can be such things as poetic truths. Taylor had, and has still, his successors, by no means all of them Irish, or even interested in Ireland. In 1946, the young American scholar Richard Ellman managed a few words with the formerly American poet T.S. Eliot on the subject of Yeats. It was essentially the English Eliot who held forth on this occasion, recalling a Yeats who never showed any of the arrogance to be found in his verse in person. The perceived mismatch here is, of course, for Eliot, a telling defect in character, if only perhaps in literary character. His belief in aristocracy is quite Irish. The Irish are snobbish about family. Irish, too, was Yeats's way with what was and what was not seriously meant. The poet's inadequacies here are part of a broader and racial failing. An Irishman can believe and not believe at the same time. Seems to think that by saying a thing, it becomes true. The categories of belief and disbelief break down. Eliot had, of course, praised Yeats in public, notably in his 1940 lecture in the late poet's honour at the Abbey Theatre, no less. But the terms of public-facing praise do not match the private conversation, though they do match what Eliot had had to say long ago in 1919, reviewing The Cutting of an Agate. This is Eliot in the Athenaeum. Mr. Yeats is not an eccentric. He eludes that kind of relationship to the comprehensible. Everywhere the difference is slight, but thorough. For when we say, not of this world, we do not point to another. When an Englishman explores the mysteries of the Kabbalah, one knows one's opinion of him. But Mr. Yeats on any subject is the cause of bewilderment and distress. Mr. Yeats's mind is a mind in some way independent of experience, and anything that occurs in that mind is of equal importance. It is a mind in which perception of fact and feeling and thinking are all a little different from ours. It is reasonable to suppose that what such a writer says is seldom going to be seriously meant. Well, Eliot was wrong for reasons of his own, and as a critic, he was not writing here, I think, in perfectly good faith. He was in many respects being wrong on purpose, and the anti-Irish animus aside, John F. Taylor might have been very proud of him. But finally, Taylor, like Eliot and like a number of Eliot's successors in the critical disparagement of Yeats, was wrong. We know this not because we are cleverer than either Taylor or Eliot, most probably we are not, but because Yeats's poetry has so clearly shown the limitations of their ideas of saying a thing. Good faith, it turns out, can indeed trump fiduciary duty in criticism, as in much else. This may be a poetic truth, perhaps, but it is nonetheless true. as a poetic legacy, it's one well worth leaving and well worth having. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
I'm aware that Peter can't see me. That's no tragedy, but perhaps something of that kind. I hope that Peter will stay on screen because we do have to have speakers and we have an audience. I wish to see our audience. Very appreciative. Thank you for a brilliant lecture. We're well accustomed to the phrase close reading of a poem, but this is more like a close reading of a mind, and the sense of Yeats as a learning mind emerging from his encounters with hostile minds and so on. Interestingly enough, J.F. Taylor receives his final monument in Ulysses, does he not? In one of his rhetorical flights, a fantasy about the Egyptians and the Irish.
It's the same speech. It's exactly the same speech.
Absolutely.
And Joyce chose to record it.
Yes, indeed.
So we can hear Joyce pretending to be
I wonder, may I ask all our panel, are we any closer to understanding whether the mind of man made up it all, lock, stock, and barrel, out of his bitter soul? Are we any closer to understanding whether the gravedigger simply turns our dead back into the human mind again? Which do seem to be propositions of belief of some kind. What we have received, at the risk of overgeneralizing, is a Yeats of extraordinary mental openness to a profound ethical dimension, which is often missing from criticism, in that sense that he was engaged with good and evil, and there was something very earnest going on when he used the title Good and Evil in the connection, and when he searched Nietzsche for an answer to that sort of question. I'm not sure how we will see now. The usual form is question time, and the audience will ask questions. But I have a sense that an element of dialogue between the speakers themselves might be useful. And for example, if Peter is here in Oxford and with us, co-present, bilocating, and perhaps there's something that you gentlemen would like to say to Peter to enlarge the argument, and then we'll open to a floor for a minute, and Rita will tell me when to stop.
At 12:30 this time.
Good. I'm passing the mic now to Matthew, please.
Thanks very much, Peter, and welcome. Can you see me at the end of the table here? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I'm waving anyway, that's me there. I could hear Bruce ask a couple of questions in his closing remarks there, which were kind of quite interesting, whether we were any closer to deciding whatever this answer was. And just to you, Peter, just to pick up on your very last words there, you were making a distinction between a truth and a poetic truth, and also wonderfully interwoven with the whole testamentary action. And when the Julian pictures came in, brilliant. I think that the end of the tower is really, as most things are where Yeats about Julian. But is there a relationship between poetic truth and what that other person, which is tainted with bad faith, poetic license? And I wonder whether you think about think a little bit more about how those two words, because when you said poetic truth, I thought you were going to say poetic license, and that's what we might say, but you didn't. I wonder what crossed your mind whenever you were putting your talk together, or thinking about these things, and also thinking about these things, it has to be said, as the editor of the currently working editor of the text as well, too.
Yeah, can you? I could hear most of that. Can you hear me if I? Yeah. Very good, very good. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we don't want to bring Philip Sidney into the room too much here, but it's this is hundreds of years difficulty about what is poetic truth. Is it an excuse? Is it a license? I think what I'm getting round to saying is that Yeats articulates kind of Yeats specific poetic truths that are not licensed, that are not trying to get away with. In other words, poetic license is very close to poetic excuse, and I find very little excuse in the best Yeats, actually. But we could come to that. I mean, actually, in answering you, Matt, I want to kind of sort of pivot round to your own talk and say that, I mean, you very brilliantly, I thought, brought in Geoffrey Hill on this, and what we're talking about now is indeed what Geoffrey is talking about, I think, when he deals with people like J.L. Austin and linguistic philosophy, if you like, speech act theory, which I'm trying to think about with Yeats. A whole book can be written on Yeats saying "I declare," and what that might be. But also, the way this is figured in what for Hill is modernism, with a nice capital M on it. And how Eliot doesn't really fit for him into that, or rather early Eliot does, but later Eliot doesn't. And now the essay, very, very important essays like Our Word is Our Bond, but then there are these later Hill approaches, not cautious approaches, bold approaches to Yeats, which is strange, because I think that Geoffrey felt himself closer to Yeats than he was ever comfortable admitting. I also suspect he felt himself somehow bested by Yeats at times, and was trying. The late stuff is trying to work out how and why. It's like, I mean, it expresses itself in competition. I mean, but we're going back to Hostile Minds. I mean, Geoffrey's entire poetic is based on saying things that the hostile minds cannot puncture. And that goes all the way, not from ideas, not really from ideas to diction, but from diction to ideas. And that's exactly how Yeats himself got it. The diction is where the ideas are born from. Same with Geoffrey. But Geoffrey was perhaps less successful there in dancing around the hostile minds, in that he had many other minds that he was aware of, some of whom were, like Eliot, deeply antipathetic to Yeats. I mean, I would say that, I'm afraid I'm implying that I think Eliot's praise of Yeats is fake, and that Eliot's hatred of Yeats or condescension to Yeats is real. And I think if we want to read that, we have to read, I think the greatest non-poet critic of a century actually is Christopher Ricks. I think he is. And we have to face up to why Christopher does not like Yeats, and really does not like Yeats. It comes down to he doesn't think Yeats means a word of it, that it's all bluff. Now, that was a siren voice for Geoffrey, and he reacted against it ultimately. He saw the cracks. But still, I think Geoffrey towards the end was still slightly hampered, slightly childish in the way he would overreact. And there is for those of you who are brave enough to find it, there's a lengthy conversation between myself and Hill on the subject of Yeats, which you can find on YouTube, where I make a complete fool of myself by reading out an early version of Adam's Curse, and saying how wonderful, expecting Geoffrey to have things to say about it, and laying all sorts of groundwork for this, to which the answer, as I recall, is simply like, that poem is no good. And that was it. That was all I could. He went on to condemn most of Yeats after that. So if you want to, you can listen to an hour of my discomfort with Geoffrey, but it's still interesting, I think. He also, in his late poetry, engages repeatedly with Yeats, repeatedly, again, fighting him on the level of diction. But he was all, even to the end, when I think he'd rejected what Christopher had to say about Yeats, he was still keen to hear bad things of him. And I remember him, for example, being tremendously heartened and pleased by a book, which I think is not a very good book at all, by W.J. McCormack, which is simply, I think, Irish begrudgery aimed at Yeats. And that was that, you know. Geoffrey, actually, there are late poems by Geoffrey Hill that are dedicated to W.J. McCormack because of this book. Okay, so a long answer, but getting back to poetic truths, they come from the diction. They're in, I mean, I'm using an inexact word when I use diction. By diction, I include vocabulary, I include syntax, I include verse form, I include